Hey everyone, it's Chris at Chris Punch Forge. Today we're going to forge a ring. And the ring itself is going to have a Calla Lily, which is a nice kind of conical shape flower, and a leaf. One end of the ring shank is going to be a leaf, and the other end of the ring shank is going to be the beautiful Calla Lily. And we're going to do that hand forging using one piece of metal. So, if you guys like that idea, you like what you see in the little card there, picture of the finished product, then check this out, because it's all hand forged, very limited amount of tools involved. If you got a hammer, you got a torch, you can do this. So, if you haven't already, checked out lionpunchforge.com, and of course, if you like these kind of videos, there's a little red subscribe button somewhere down in here. Give it a little tickle and hit that bell notification. That helps me grow the channel and make more videos for you guys. So as always, let's do this. Okay, I'm going to try my crude drawing skills here on my anvil and show you kind of what we're doing. We're going to start off with a ring shank, and one side of that ring shank is going to be elongated and stretched out like that. Eventually we're going to curl that over to create the flower or the Calla Lily, and then we'll do some balled up brass stamens. Then the other side is going to be thinned down, and we're going to create a leaf, maybe engraved. And then once we have that particular pattern, we're going to bend it around into a ring to create a Calla Lily on one side and a leaf on the other out of one piece of metal. Alright, for this ring I'm going to use this kind of flat ring band stock. It's got a half round on one side, flat on the bottom, and it is approximately, let's zero these out real quick, width is going to be 3.28 and the height is going to be about 173. Now as far as the length goes, I have to figure out exactly what size ring band I want to make. I think in this occasion I'm going to make it a 9. So what I'm going to do to measure that is I'm going to start bending my metal around my ring mandrel here. And a couple things are going to happen while we're making this ring. Since we're forming, we're actually going to have this end up being a little bit longer than what we cut it. So right now this is a little bit longer than a 9. I'm going to come up here, tighten this down a little bit, and right now that's at about an 8. So I'm going to leave a little bit on this end, and I'm going to leave a little bit on this end, and later on we can adjust that if we need to. So figure out what size ring you want, take it to your ring mandrel, figure out just a little bit smaller, because as you're hammering it's going to lengthen out. And you're going to want to make a little bit of room for that lengthening. So size 9 is what I want. I'm aiming for that. It'll probably be a little bit over that depending on my forming. So that can be fixed, and I'm going to go ahead and cut it right about here. So I have just kind of a little tail on each end. So let me go ahead and do that, and I'll be back in a second. Alright, that's essentially what I'm starting with. Now that I've bent that around, I'm going to want to straighten it out because I'm going to want to forge it. And before I start forging it, since I bent it around a mandrel, I cut it, I'm going to take it over and anneal it before I start working with it. Just use a rawhide mallet to straighten this out a little. Alright, so that's what I'm starting with. In case you're wondering, because I know people are going to ask, how long is that piece of metal, Chris? Well, let me tell you. This one is about 87 millimeters, a little under 87.5 millimeters. That doesn't matter because your metal is going to lengthen out and you've got plenty to play with here. So I'm going to go ahead and anneal this real quick, and then I will come back and we'll talk about the forging side. Alright, to forge this out, first we're going to want to make our Calla Lily end. So this ring band is going to need to look like this, approximately. So how I'm going to do that is, we know how metal moves under a hammer when we're forging it. If you're using a ball peen, it spreads out in all directions. If we're using a like a flathead, it moves out in all directions. If we use a cross peen though, we know that it only moves in approximately 2 directions, this way and this way, as long as the hammer is oriented like this. So there's my end, here's my cross peen. If I hammer right along that area, my metal is going to stretch out like that. So we're going to do that first. I'm going to use a cross peen. Let me find a handy dandy one here. I'm going to use one of my Wubbers cross peens, just because I love them. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is start by hammering just like that. To make that go a little bit easier, to spread it out a little faster, I'm going to take a chasing hammer here, and I'm going to make it larger. I'm spreading it all directions now. And now that I have it spread out a little bit, I'm going to take my cross peen and I'm going to isolate those into spreading out even farther. I'm isolating up in here so that I can spread that out even more. Now I can take my chasing hammer again and at this point I'm going to anneal again, because I've worked hard in that material and I do not want it to crack. I want to make sure it's nice and supple and fun to work with. So I'm going to go do that, anneal it, and I'll be back. Alright, I'm back and we are annealed, and what I'm going to do now is continue on with, and dry that off. I don't want to work with wet materials in my anvil and hammer, so dry that off a little bit better. I'm going to continue with the cross peen, and I'm going to now not go so hard, but go to texture the metal. Zoom out a little bit here. And so what I want to do is create that linear texture that will mimic the look of a Calla Lily when I bend it over. Okay, the other thing I'm doing is I know that I'm gonna wrap it around and fold it later on. So what I'm doing to assist me with that is I'm thinning out the center of the band so that it doesn't have a large rigid point when I start curling it. I want it to curl naturally, and by doing that, or in order to have it do that, I need to thin out this center area. Like if I were making a joint in a bezel or something like that, I want to create a bend point, a weak point for it to flow into. And so that's essentially what I'm doing here, is I'm isolating the middle of the ring band where I want it to eventually curl over. Now, if you have a hard time with your hammer accurately striking, which is really the most important thing when it comes to forging, is hammer accuracy, you can use a punch or a another, like a chasing tool or something like that. Let me find one here. Alright, so there's a little chasing tool. I'm going to grab a hammer that I use for not fine textures, but for striking. And I'm going to align my punch or my chasing tool or whatever it is right in that area. So if you don't have good hammer strike accuracy, you can do this. Okay, that doesn't look too bad. The fun thing about doing this is that it does create a natural looking texture, which is kind of what you want with a calla lily or a natural looking flower. The more realistic it looks, more fun it is. Alright, so I'm gonna just a little bit more here. And it's time for me to anneal again. A lot of annealing in this process. Alright, we are annealed, and you can see the thinning that takes place with the forging process. My metal's a lot thinner on that end, which is fine because eventually I'm going to curl it. So at this point, I'm going to extend just this tip out a little bit with my cross peen, and that's going to assist me later on when I curl it. Okay, now we get to work on the leaf side. Now for the leaf side, let's go around our mandrel real quick and check our side. We can always straighten it out and anneal again. Right now we're looking really nice as far as our size. So we're still good on size. And I'll go ahead and pull this out, and we can start working on the leaf before we anneal, because I really haven't work hardened that other end very much. Alright, so here is where interesting forging stuff takes place. I'm going to make my leaf, and in order to make my leaf, make sure I have them on camera, I'm going to need to push down on this portion of the metal to create an isolation. And I isolate that, it's going to pinch it down, probably more here. Get rid of that. It's going to pinch it down, and then when I flatten this portion out, it's going to basically, so if I flatten one out, it could look like this, but if I flatten it and isolate it, I end up looking like that, where it kind of bows in like that. And I'll show you how that works. Before I do that though, I'm going to file the end of this wire to a point, like a rounded point almost. Alright, now I have a kind of rounded point filed on the end there, and what that's going to allow me to do is that when I flatten it out, it's going to create kind of that leaf shape. But before I flatten it out, I'm going to want to isolate it. And to do that, I'm going to use the thick end of one of my Wubbers hammers. And I'm going to mark it so I know where I'm striking. I want the leaf to approximately be that big. So I'm going to strike just below that and isolate. And I'll use the corner of my anvil to do so. Let me zoom out so you guys can see that. Now that I have that little isolation happening, I'm going to taper this side slightly. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and take it over and anneal again. Alright, to taper that down, what I'm going to do is hang the leaf off of my anvil so that I'm not touching that material as I'm hammering. And then I'll take my little chasing hammer and hammer a little bit around it, just trying to taper that down to look a little bit more natural. I have a little bit of a taper now on that ring shank. Zoom in, show you a little bit more. And now what I'm going to do is flatten that leaf out, and I can do that with my chasing hammer. And I'm going to hang it over the edge of the anvil, or hang the rest of the ring over the edge of the anvil, so that I can isolate that material only. Okay, now I have a leaf. And in order to kind of refine that a little bit, I can go back with my cross peen and isolate that material a little bit more. I've got an edge here I don't like, which I can file out, but the whole point of this is forging, so I'm hanging it over the edge of my anvil and trying to isolate that material that looks like it's got a little bend to it. Okay, now we want it to look natural, so I'm going to add a little bit of texture using a chasing hammer, not hard, just to kind of blend everything in a little bit. I want it to look fun. I'm going to use the ball peen of my chasing here to spread out the leaf just a little bit more. Okay, now I have that shape. And before I do anything else, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of flatten this off a little bit. And I'm going to engrave the leaf before I do any kind of forming and anything on this end as well. I want a nice flat piece for engraving. Okay, I'm all set up on my engraving ball. I did take a file and kind of smooth out the edges of that leaf a little bit. And now what I'm going to do is find a Sharpie and blacken that out so that I can kind of see where I'm engraving. Alright. And what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to be using this nice little sharp point in the Line Punch Forge engraving adapter. But before I do that, I'm going to use it just as a scribe to figure out what I want my lines to be like approximately. So that gives me just kind of a guide on what I want it to look like. Now I'm going to go ahead and get to business. First pass is very, very light. And this is just a scratch pass. Give me an idea of what I want it to look like. Okay, that's going to give me a general idea of what I want that leaf to look like. Now what I'm going to do is change out to a smaller V shape or kind of a little gouge. Let me find one of my bits. My little engravers. So you may notice the color of the engraving adapter changed. That's only because instead of completely switching out the engraver, I have a couple different engraving adapters and I just keep different engravers in them. So that way I can just switch out the engraving adapter and keep that engraver locked in there. Now I have to find an Allen wrench that works. That'll do it. Alright, so this one has a little bit more of a, come on, focus. Oh my god. Alright, so that one has a little bit more of a V, and what I'm going to do with this one is just go right down the center before I change out my engraver again. Alright, that is one way you can tell whether or not you have a sharp engraver, is to like see if it slides on your thumbnail. If it does, then you can stand to sharpen it a little bit more. This just digs in right away, so we're going to take another pass here. Okay, now I'm going to switch out to another tool. You may have seen this in one of my other videos. It's a lining tool that I use that's not necessarily used for that particular technique. So it's a burr, a cylinder burr, and what I'm going to do is I've chucked it up into another engraving adapter, and I end up using the lines in that to create more delicate lines in whatever I'm engraving. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. A little bit more over here I missed. Okay, now I'm going to go right down the center. I'll clean that up a little bit. Turn that light off. So, I'm just going to do a little cleaning. And I'm going to do a little bit of cross hatching. That cross hatching is going to act kind of like shading when it comes to patina or sanding. Okay, so there's my leaf, nice engraved, and I'm going to go ahead and, since I'm going to be forming it now, I'm going to go ahead and anneal it before I start that. Alright, there are a couple different ways to start this curve for the Calla Lily flower. One way is to use one of these steel blocks, place it in there, and then just start forming it around. A lot of these steel blocks have sharp edges. I don't necessarily like that because it'll mar the back of your silver. I ended up making one out of purple heart wood, and all it does is I just used a couple files and created grooves in it, and that way I can form metal down into it and not have to worry about textures on the other side. So I'm going to grab a little smaller one here, and you can actually also use a very tiny punch, dapping punch, to start the small, find my hammer. I'll use a rawhide for this. I don't want to mar too much, I just want to form it in. Get a little bit bigger punch. And I'm just going to start that around. Now, once you get it to that point, what you can do is grab a little half-round plier, or round nose pliers, and just start forming that around. You're going to want to make sure that you form around the bottom part, and I can do that on my wood block with my cross peen. I want to try and isolate that material down. Remember that material I thinned out right here? I'm going to want to push that over. Back to my groove. And ideally what I want to do is close up this portion first. Alright, under the annealed state, it allows me to do a little bit more forming to taper this down, close up a little bit, and I'm going to use the ball peen part of my hammer to do that. Okay. Now that I have a little Calla Lily end, I'm going to work on that a little bit with my round nose, and I'm going to form it a little bit better by folding it around, opening it up a little bit, making it look more flower-like. What I can do is, I have one of my punches around here, I can take a tiny punch and just kind of open that up a little bit. Look as natural as possible. So I'm just going to go through and clean up some of those tool marks. In case you're wondering, these are Wubbers hammers. I really like them. Okay, now that I've done that, I have basically what in blacksmithing you'd refer to as a cold shut right here. So two pieces of metal that are closed together, cold, which means they're not welded together. And that's okay for this because I'm going to put some solder in there and strengthen that up a little bit. And then what I'm also going to do is take a little piece of balled up brass. So I'm actually going to be doing a little bit of soldering in there. So I'll ball those up, put a couple inside, and then I'll do that after I get done forming the rest of the ring. But that way I can clean it up and have the solder flow exactly where I want it to flow. But right now we're going to do the forming. And in order to do that, I got to anneal again. Alright, so you're annealed. I'm going to wipe it off. I'm going to grab some half-round pliers here. Alright, so before you do anything else in bending, I like to add my touch mark or whatever mark you want to add in there. So I'm going to put that on the band. Do that. So I have my touch mark already on there, and I don't need to worry about doing it later on. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to add a little bit of a dimension to this leaf, and I'm going to use the purple heart block again and one of my purple punchers, and I'm just going to tap them down into one of those grooves to add a little bit of dimension. It's going to be easier to do that now than it is after bending. Okay, I've got kind of a cup shape there, and now I'm going to want to bend my ring around. And I'm going to need to kind of lightly persuade that to go into place. So I'm going to use a nylon. And I'm going to have basically that shape. Now, what I want to do is kind of make it unified a bit. So what I may end up doing is moving these around just a little bit so they're not straight like this, but they're kind of bent around. This is going to be a solder joint here, and then once I'm soldered up, I can then form the ring down into the mandrel to make it conform a little bit more. But first I want to create that joint so that it gives me a solid pivot point for that forming. Alright, I was able to cross them over, solder them together, and then I went over and I balled up 2 little tiny brass wires. Brass, if you ball it up, you need to flux it first, otherwise it'll do this weird kind of nasty thing that doesn't work real well. So it will ball up, it just needs to be fluxed first. So what I'm going to do is, off camera, I'm going to stick those 2 in there. Zoom in. Maybe. And solder them in place. Then I can go and do my cleanup and polish this up, and you have a ring. So, alright everyone, I had a catastrophic mistake, but I'm still going to post this video online. So what happened was I was being stupid and I was using my plumber's torch instead of my actual soldering torch to heat up and fuse and all that kind of fun stuff, and I melted the little area that was my Calla Lily. But rather than scrap the ring and start over, I thought that I would go ahead and illustrate a way to embrace mistakes, because mistakes equal learning, and the more we learn, hopefully means the mistakes that we've learned from. So I still have my nice leaf. It's still soldered to the shank, but my tip here, where my Calla Lily was, it was a little bit thin and my torch was too hot and my heat control sucked, and here I am. So what I ended up doing is I used a ball burr to channel out the area that was left, and then I put in little tiny jeweler's bronze balls. So can't go wrong with bronze balls. Put that in there, soldered them in place, and now I have something different than I intended, but still kind of a fun little ring. I like the two-tone effect. I'll have to polish this up, and I like it. So I will do a redo of this video showing a successful Calla Lily that I don't melt, but I think it's important to post this video and show everyone that mistakes happen, and just because they happen doesn't mean you don't also end up with an interesting piece of jewelry. So that's my mistake. I own it. I'll fix it, but I want you guys all to see it too. So we'll go ahead and do this, and that is going to be polished, and that's done. So thank you guys for watching once again, and this is what I have ended up with.